So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Tom Miles, and I'm the Dean of the Law School. And it is a great pleasure to welcome you to today's very special event, our inaugural Donald M. Ephraim Prize Lecture. From our very beginning, the University of Chicago Law School, which is a professional school situated by design within a research university, has been committed to interdisciplinary scholarship. Our faculty have sought to draw knowledge and methods from other disciplines in order to expand our understanding of law and the legal system. And often these interdisciplinary ideas have created whole new paradigms for understanding the law, our legal systems, even the broader world. And this scholarship has often challenged conventional wisdoms. And one of the most powerful examples of these values at the University of Chicago Law School has been the emergence of economic analysis of law, or law economics. Law economics has influenced our understanding of nearly every field of law, and within some fields of law, it is now the primary methodology for understanding that area of law. And all of this happened within little more than a generation, and law economics became a standard feature of legal education within the United States. And I'm very happy to say that law and economics began here at the University of Chicago. And through our incredible faculty, amazing legends and names such as Aaron Director, Ronald Coase, Richard Posner, and so many others, the University of Chicago was the birthplace of law and economics. And more than that, it has been the intellectual powerhouse that propelled these ideas throughout the legal academy and into the world. And I'm thrilled that this intellectual leadership continues today through the Donald M. Ephraim Prize Lecture. The Donald M. Ephraim Prize in Law and Economics recognizes an early career scholar in the field of law and economics whose work has advanced the state of knowledge in law and economics and whose intellectual impact has the potential to reach the legal academy, the legal profession, and beyond. The recipient is chosen through a competitive process in which there's an international call for nominees, and then a faculty committee here at the law school selects a deserving recipient. And the chair of our selection committee was our deputy dean, Professor William Hubbard, and I thank him and the selection committee for their careful work in their selection of today's recipient. The prize recipient then spends several days here at the law school, sharing ideas with our faculty members and delivering the Ephraim Prize Lecture. And in this way, the Donald M. Ephraim Prize ensures that the University of Chicago Law School, as the birthplace of law and economics, remains the destination for pioneering scholarship in the field. And the prize was established through the generosity and wisdom of Donald Ephraim, a member of the law school class of 1955. Don's career is filled with accomplishments in multiple domains, and his path is an inspiration for our students today. After attending DePaul for college and serving in the Army, Don came to the law school where he was taught by such legends as Llewellyn, Menchikoff, Meltzer, Katz, and Blum. And upon graduating, Don launched a very successful law practice focused principally on taxes and estate planning. Somewhere along the way, he picked up a CPA. Don's career began a new chapter when he took on as a client Johnny Morris, star halfback of the Chicago Bears, and still the team's all-time leader in receiving yards. When a television station offered Morris the opportunity for a sportscasting job, he asked Don Ephraim to help him negotiate the contract. And Morris went on to a very successful and lengthy career as a sportscaster. In following the success of that engagement, Don founded Ephraim and Associates, which has become a leader in entertainment representation. His client list in Chicago and nationwide is a who's who of national media and entertainment luminaries. Now, Don is now retired from Ephraim's and Associates and devotes his time to philanthropy and to community service. And this, like everything in his career, he does in an astounding way. Don has generously supported arts, educational, and cultural endeavors here in Chicago and in Palm Beach and nationwide. We are especially fortunate that Don has supported the University of Chicago Law School, particularly in the area of law and economics. For example, in 2020, he established the Donald M. Ephraim Professorship in Law and Economics. Our colleague, Professor Tony Casey, is the inaugural holder of that professorship, and through his extraordinary leadership, Teaching, scholarship, and service, Tony is building a great legacy for the Ephraim Professorship, following in the footsteps of those luminaries who taught Don, Llewellyn, Menshikoff, Meltzer, Blum, and others. So I'm honored that Don is with us today. Welcome, Don. I would like to invite you to the podium to say a few words. And again, welcome home to the law school.
Thank you, Tom, for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here today at the inaugural award of the John L. Ephraim Prize in Law and Economics. I want to congratulate Megan Stevenson as a very deserving winner and express my happiness that she has recovered from long COVID, which postponed the ceremony awaiting her recovery. I want to thank Professor Hubbard and his selection committee for awarding the prize to such a very qualified recipient. I also want to thank Dean Miles for permitting me to establish this award and working with me on its creation. I am not unmindful of the fact that the Nobel Prize in Economics has just been awarded. I am sorry that our prize has not yet exceeded the Nobel in prestige or remuneration. But apparently, dynamite is more lucrative than a law practice. When I was young, the Great Depression and World War II were occurring, along with substantial and virulent anti-Semitism, which severely restricted my father's choice of jobs and salary. My mother managed the economics without benefit of a degree. For example, as a child, my family's meal menu consisted of just two choices: take it or leave it. The law school was instrumental in preparing me for the practice of law, which provided me with the funds from which this award is derived. As we all know, economics really affects just about everything in society and the choices we make. I recently read a quote of Andy Borowitz made some years ago, but which is applicable today. He said, "It would be nice to spend billions of dollars on schools and roads, but right now, that money is desperately needed for political ads." Well, I want to thank you all for coming today, and let me bring back Tom Miles.
Thank you very much, John. We're honored that you're here today, and thank you for your vision and dedication to our law school and to the importance of ideas and to shining a light on ideas of the highest quality through this prize and to the whole concept of scholarly excellence at the law school. In law and economics, we believe in the power of incentives, and so I look forward to all the great ideas and great scholarship that is going to be inspired by this prize. And so I'm thrilled then to introduce today's inaugural recipient of the Donald M. Ephraim Prize, Professor Megan Stevenson. Professor Stevenson is the Henry L. and Grace Doherty Charitable Foundation Professor of Law at the University of Virginia Law School. Professor Stevenson is an economist and a criminal justice scholar. She has conducted quantitative research in areas such as bail, algorithmic risk assessment, sentencing, and juvenile justice. She is a prolific scholar and has published extensively in both law reviews and peer-reviewed journals. She holds both undergraduate and a PhD degrees from the University of California in Berkeley. She began her academic career at George Mason, and in 2020 she joined the faculty at the University of Virginia Law School. The topic of Professor Stevenson's lecture is what randomized controlled trials teach us about the structure of the social world. Congratulations, Professor Stevenson, and welcome to the University of Chicago Law School.
Hi, everybody. It's It's really nice to see you all. As Don mentioned, I have been dealing with long COVID for almost 2 years, and so I'm finally back in the world. This is, I think, the first in-person talk that I've given. I've taught, so I've been in front of people before, but this is a real pleasure and a real honor to have received this prize, and great to see all of your faces. So I was telling William last night that when I first got his email, the email of just can we talk? What's your number? I was like, what? A little nervous. But when I got it, I was beyond thrilled. When I got it, I was currently working on this paper that I'm going to be presenting for you today. So the title of the paper is Cause, Effect, and the Structure of the Social World. And in many ways, it's sort of a culmination or a turning point for me as a scholar. It's way bigger in scope than most of my research. Most of my research answers narrow questions. Like on Thursday, I'm going to talk about a current project about how incarceration affects wealth. This is a big picture. I mean, I'm talking about the structure of the social world. So this is a reach for me, but it felt, honestly, it was something that had been brewing for a long time. And at one point, I was just like, this is so important. I'm going to write it down. And I hope you guys find it as interesting as I do. So let's get started. I'll give a brief overview of the paper, and then we'll dive in. Let me keep track of my time here. All right, so this paper is built around a key empirical claim that I've developed, after my 10 years of writing in empirical research in the criminal justice space. And the key claim is that a broad look at RCTs in criminal justice since the 1970s reveals two things. So first, most reforms and interventions as studied by RCTs were not successful. And the few that were mostly did not replicate in other times or places. And this is a fact that I think is pretty broadly known among people that work in the field, but it's never really given systematic conversation. And as it turns out, it seems like almost no one outside of those of us doing work in this field were aware of this. So I think this is a fact that at first glance, people might say, this is really depressing, right? Like we were hoping to use these tools to figure out how to improve the world. And I think there's that way of looking at it. But the way that I look at it right now is that this actually teaches us something really kind of profound and important about the structure of the social world. And at least at the level of questions answerable by RCTs, and I'll talk more about what that means in a minute, RCTs, randomized control trials, the social world is full of stabilizing forces that resist change. So to whatever extent the intervention altered your path for a short period of time, the forces of life and the way the world is structured kind of pushes you back onto the path you would have been on absent the intervention. Cascades, which is a term that I use, it's sort of similar to the idea of a tipping point, but a small intervention that leads to, large and lasting change. That this idea of cascades are mostly a myth, and something that I've been calling the engineer's view of social change is not supported. So that's just a quick overview of where we're going with the argument in this paper, and we'll cover each of those statements in a lot more detail. So first of all, I want to give you a brief overview of randomized control trials. For many of you in this room, you know exactly what those are. And for other of you, you're like, I vaguely remember that phrase, but I have no idea. So randomized control trials, or RCTs, are considered the gold standard in evaluating whether a particular intervention or policy or whatever is effective. Now, they sort of got they're most widely known in the medical space. You basically have to do an RCT in order to get a drug approved by the FDA. That's how we know that, vaccines are effective. That's how we know certain medicines are effective or not effective. It's the very core of determining whether something works in the medical space. This has spilled over from the medical space into social science for many, many decades now. And it's considered the gold standard of figuring out, did this policy make a difference? Did this job training program lead to more jobs? Did this rehabilitative program reduce rearrest rates? And so on and so forth. So what an RCT involves is just randomly allocating a group of people either to treatment or control. So you have a whole bunch of people. Let's just say there's a drug treatment program and you've got 200 people that want to enroll. There's only room for 100. How are you going to choose which ones to allow in? You randomize. So now you've got 100 people that are taking this drug treatment program because they were randomly selected in. Another 100 people who did not take this program because they were randomly selected out. And because these two groups were selected at random, they're similar in basically all ways, except for one group got the treatment program and one group did not. So if a year from now, these people did a drug test and we found that the drug usage rates were lower in the group that did the treatment program, there's a really strong case to be made that that is because of the drug treatment program. Because any other explanation you can come up with is not that convincing because the two groups are so similar. You can't say, well, it's just because those, the people that were randomized, that did the drug treatment program, they wanted it more. They were more motivated. No, they should have been exactly as motivated as the people who wanted in but randomly couldn't get in, and so on and so forth. So that's the basic idea about randomized control trials. That's also, just so you know, that's the basic idea behind all methods of causal inference. There are all sort of variations on the theme of you take two groups of people who are otherwise similar, expose one group to an intervention or a law or a policy or whatever it is. If at the end of the day the two groups have different outcomes, we infer that this is because of the policy or the law or the intervention. All right. Oh gosh, you know what? This is the problem with having slides behind me. I forget, I'm like flipping the page in front of me and forgetting that you guys are not with me. Anyway, so these slides just say exactly what I said. So we're just gonna go ahead to the next one, which is why focus on RCTs. So there's a whole wide variety of methods that are used to evaluate the causal impact of this thing or that thing. The common story for why people think RCTs are the gold standard is that they're less prone to selection bias, meaning that because groups were randomized towards receiving treatment versus control, we really can be sure, as long as your group is large enough, that they're going to be similar on average across these two groups. But for me, it's not as much about selection bias, but for me, it's also about publication bias. So publication bias, I'm going to use that term broadly to describe the set of incentives that researchers face that lead to the suppression of null results or kind of failures to find any meaningful effect or any lasting effect, and to a promotion of statistically significant successes. Now, this is absolutely rampant across the field. It is a widely acknowledged problem. I'm not the first one to bring this up, but it's a big problem. It's a really big problem. And because what it means is that we've got this filter system, which filters out the failures and only shows you the successes. And this problem, the biases that come from these incentives, this publication bias, it's true across all research designs, but the problem is less bad with randomized control trials. And it's less bad for two reasons. One is there's fewer degrees of freedom. There's fewer ways that a researcher can tweak to try and, get the cherry pick to get their desired result. And it's also less bad because randomized control trials have a certain cachet. People, I think they're considered the gold standard. So they're easier to publish even if you don't get exciting results. So once again, I am behind on my slide clicking. This makes, even though evidence from RCTs might be less biased, we still expect it to be subject to a certain amount of this bias, which once again hides from view the failures and makes prominent the successes. This makes the lack of success, when you look at the universe of published RCTs, even more striking. All right, so I want to, before we dive in, this is a paper about what we learn from RCT studies. So I want to be precise about the types of studies that are the types of questions that RCTs answer, because that's That's the domain of what we're talking about when we talk about what RCTs teach us about the structure of the social world. So RCTs teach us about the impacts of systems conserving change. You need, in order to hold all else constant, you need to hold the entire system that a person or a group is operating within constant and only tweak on one parameter. These tend to be limited scope types of interventions. You kind of need, by definition, to have reasonably limited scope interventions if you hold all else constant. You can't randomize class. You can randomize income to a certain extent. You can give somebody like a UBI type guaranteed income check, but you can't randomly allocate them also a fancier degree and a lot of like cultural know-how and all of the things that create class in society. It also means that we're focusing on non-obvious questions. So RCTs do not generally answer things like, if you give food to hungry people, are they less hungry at the end of the day? Like, it's more just like, if you give food to people, are they therefore going to have a higher grade point average when they graduate? It's the more the indirect questions, the more complicated causal chains that RCTs are evaluating. Now, critics sometimes argue that RCTs answer kind of small bore questions, like they're just not important. And I think to a certain extent that's true. This has been the main critique levied against RCTs. But I also think that's a little bit understating the importance of what they answer. RCTs answer answerable questions, like actionable questions, things that you can go out and do. If you're a government agency, or you're a nonprofit, or you're a philanthropist, or you're just a very motivated human being that wants to go out and try something and do something on your own, generally, you're not going to, a single person or organization can't go and change the whole system by themselves, usually. They can tweak on a parameter. They can tweak on one thing. They can offer, they can offer cash. They can offer money. They can offer a programming. They can do the types of things that RCTs are able to tell you the impact of. And if the world worked in specific ways, RCTs would provide enormously valuable information. If these things that I call cascades are prevalent, which is small interventions that lead, that kind of culminate and snowball in a positive reinforcing cycle, to really change the trajectory of someone's life for the better. If we could identify these with RCTs, that would be amazing. That would be really valuable information. Or even in a more modest type of way of thinking, if you can, if the world works in a sort of simple, manipulable manner by which you just identify you do a pilot test, you identify if something works. If it works, you scale up, you ship it out, you improve it, then you're on, okay, let's tweak on the next margin, figure out if it works. If it does, it's a best practice. You scale up, move on. This would be great. RCTs would be providing incredibly valuable information. All right. So, but what I'm going to argue is that we don't live in that world. And here's just kind of re-summing up the structure of the argument, and we're going to dive into some of the evidence about what RCTs have shown us. So, just recapping, as I said, RCTs teach us about the impact of limited scope interventions beyond obvious mechanical effects. A broad look at RCT evidence can teach us something about the structure of the social world on the level of questions answerable by RCTs. And in the remainder of this talk, we're going to look at what 50 plus years of RCTs in criminal justice teaches us about the structure of the social world and discuss implications. So we've done some of that so far, and that's where we're going. All right. So what I'm about to do is try to convince you that if you look at RCTs in the criminal justice space, you're going to find most of the interventions weren't successful, and the few that were do not replicate. So that's a big task. I'm trying to tell you something about the entirety of research in this field, at least using this methodology. And so in order to break that task down a little bit more, I've adapted a three-pronged strategy. So the first thing I'm going to do is discuss a paper that I found, which kind of takes on a big chunk of that. The paper looks at 50 years of randomized control trials with crime as an outcome. They also have to have at least 100 people per study and be written in English. Then I'm going to look at famous instances of success. Like the first one that was like, wow, this is great. We finally found something that really works. And look what happened when people tried to replicate it in other times or places. And then I'm going to look at various hot topics in criminal justice, things you guys have all heard about, like body cameras or hotspots policing, things like that. Areas of criminal justice where there have been enough studies done on this area that you can kind of take a broad look at what a bunch of studies have found, thereby hopefully minimizing the publication bias project a little bit. All right. So let's start with this big review paper I was talking about. So this 2006 study looked at every RCT within the previous 50 years. Only 29 of the 122 studies found statistically significant results in the desired direction. Barely more than half showed an effect pointed in the desired direction. Now, I just want to remind you, this is after like so many layers of researcher and publisher incentives have already shielded away the failures. These are the ones that have made it through into the world, gotten published. The researcher bothered to write it up to begin with. Somebody was like, this is valuable, let's publish it. And so even despite this bias, we still find kind of not a lot of success. But you could argue, okay, well, maybe we didn't succeed in most of this, but 29 studies, what about those? That could be important, valuable information that we can go and apply and replicate in other places. Unfortunately, most of these original successes, nobody even tried to replicate them. Which is another kind of problem in the publication bias. So we don't really know, was it a success or was it a fluke? Of the ones that were prominent enough that got multiple attempts to replicate, very, very few studies actually replicated. So I put up here 4 kind of famous, if you're in my world, famous studies that had huge success, that got published in the top paper. Probably the most famous one is perhaps swift, certain, and fair sanctions, where the idea was that if you really want to deter people on probation from continuing to use drugs, instead of kind of waiting until they've screwed up a whole bunch and then revoking their probation and sending them to jail, you have to immediately, the day they come in and test positive when they're not supposed to, they have to do 24 hours in jail. And the next time they do it, it's 48. So it sort of seemed to make sense. Like, we respond more to immediate punishment than we do to uncertain, distant punishment, even if the immediate punishment is light and the later one is going to be more harsh. Unfortunately, this one, it got so much attention, it was adopted in like over 100 different jurisdictions around the United States. They did very well-funded, large, careful RCTs, and basically there's very little evidence of success in other places. And similar story with these other things I listed up there. And now finally, I want to touch on these widely studied topics in criminal justice. So for example, we're looking at things like job training programs, body-worn cameras, intensive probation, drug courts, things like that. And by and large, you just don't find much effect. So hotspots policing, you do find an effect. Hotspots policing, by the way, it's like, criminologists identify some corners, or like, these are high crime corners, let's send a bunch of police there. If you send a bunch of police there, reported crime does go down in that area. So that's the sort of success. We find that it goes down on those corners. But even in the words of people that are most proponents of this, it doesn't go, it's a small effect. It doesn't go down by that much. And we're not really certain if we've reduced crime on net or if we've just sent it off to the corner, 2 streets down. So not a huge effect. The job training programs, this one was a real harsh one for me, because I think this is maybe even what started me thinking about this process. So, you could make a pitch that when people are released from prison, they're they're fragile. They're like in a vulnerable place in their life, right? They need to get stabilized. They need to get a job. They need to get an apartment. They need to like get their feet back on the ground. Because if they don't, they just send them out the prison doors with almost nothing, maybe $20 in their pocket. They're liable to like get caught back up in things that they shouldn't get caught back up. So if you have these job training programs that can offer them subsidized employment, offer them, help in building their resume and, have an outfit to wear to an interview and so forth, that this would really be helpful, that this would get them employed, that would start this positive cycle whereby, that they get an apartment, they get stable in their lives, so on and so forth, the virtuous cycle. It just didn't work out that way. Those short-term increases due to the subsidy in employment because it was subsidized, and then as soon as the subsidization ended, both employment rates and rearrest rates were virtually identical to the group that were not randomly allocated into these programs. All right, so that's the summary of the literature, more or less. We can go into more details during Q&A if you want, but that's the kind of like a highlight of what the main empirical claim of the paper is trying to say. Now, I argue that this actually, again, this might be disappointing to a certain extent. I think we really hope to be able to learn valuable things and improve the world, but I actually think this teaches us something incredibly powerful, that if we know it, we can move forward and with more wisdom in terms of thinking about how the world works and how we can make it a better place. And so what I'm going to say right here about what it teaches us about the structure of the social world, I want to pause and say something first, which is that I'm not saying anything new at this point. What I'm trying to do is take everything that I talked about the lack of kind of success or the lack of replicability in these randomized control trials and put it in slightly more abstract terms. Because for me, I think abstraction can be helpful. If it's not helpful for you, if it's confusing, that's fine. But I just want you to know we're not leaving you behind. All I'm doing is kind of re-articulating this in a slightly different way. So I think a broad look at research in using RCTs in the criminal justice space teaches us something about the structure of the social world. And it teaches us that when it comes to limited scope interventions, stabilizing forces push people back on the path they would have been on absent the intervention. Cascades, once again, small interventions that lead to large and lasting effect, the kind of tipping point idea, are rare. And that to the extent that at least some of the occasional successes are actual successes and not just a fluke of publication bias or whatever, they're complex and context dependent, which makes it hard to replicate them in other settings. There's something about the unique combination of people and place that make this just simply not port well to other times or places. All right. So let's talk briefly about the scope of the claim. So first you might wonder, does this apply in other areas of the social world outside of the criminal legal space? So I'm gonna say that I think yes. I'm not gonna spend a ton of time trying to convince you, and if you're happy with just believing this is a claim about the social world as it pertains to criminal justice, that's fine. But I think it's yes for two reasons. First of all, my claim about what RCTs can define is definitely not limited to the criminal justice space. Now, people can kind of quibble about the details, but as long as we're in the social science world, many areas of social science also find that interventions rarely have lasting impact. There was a prominent one that came out a couple months ago about a big study that gave guaranteed income to people, and everyone was hoping it's gonna improve their health and allow them to move up into a different job or preferable job or all these sort of things. And it really, what it did? It made them have to work less at their crappy job, which in my mind is a win. I think that's fine. But it didn't have the sort of indirect grand effects that a lot of people had hoped for. And the second reason that I think that it applies outside of the criminal justice space is more theoretical. And I'm gonna switch into econ speak for a moment, so apologies, but I think people are maximizing their utility subject to their constraints already. And which means that people are already out there trying to make the world as best they can for them, for their lives and themselves and their family and their community. People are already working to remove whatever barriers, that they're facing to get at whatever they want. And in a way, it's sort of patronizing to think that we can just come in and just that easily remove the final barriers, and all of a sudden like magic, we've cured them, we've cured your problems, And so if you think of this as it's just something about the nature of the human spirit that's going out there and already trying to create the world that they want to live in. I don't think this is something that is unique to poor people, even rich people. They might start from a place where they have more advantages, fewer barriers, but they're still out there trying to make their lives the best they can. And to the extent that there are barriers that are still remaining in populations other than the ones that are kind of justice involved, it seems likely to me that these barriers would be sticky as well. Because if they weren't, I think people would have figured out a way around them already. So the second question in terms of the scope of the claim is, does it apply outside of questions answered and answerable by RCTs? And here I think I would make a less clear statement. So the way I think about it, I think about causal inference research sort of on a scale. And on the one end of the scale, you have RCTs, which are really looking at, they can very kind of credibly answer questions about pretty limited scope type interventions. On the other end of the scale, you have interventions that are so large in scope or so systemic, so deeply entangled with life, that, you really can't, it's really hard to even use causal thinking about this. You can't imagine, people talk about police abolition a lot. And when you step to think about it, you're like, how can you, it's really hard for me to even imagine what that world would be like, because I have no experience with a setting that is otherwise similar, but without police. There's just so many things that would need to change to get to that point. We just can't, you can't answer causal questions about anything on that scale. And so I think this claim that I've been making applies mostly to issues that are closer to the realm of RCTs, limited scope interventions, systems conserving type change. I don't know that it says anything much about this other kind of more systemic change. All right. So let's just talk about a few implications, and then I want to make sure you guys have time for questions, and I'm sure this, people are getting ready to eat some food. So, okay. So I'm just going to talk. This I'm done, by the way. This is the meat of the paper. So if y'all are with me until now, I'm happy, I'm satisfied. There's an end part of the paper that's implications. That's a little bit more loose. Just thinking about some different things that this brings up for me. And I'm going to just point out two for today. So the first one is having to do with something that I call the engineer's view. And just to be clear about what the engineer's view is, it's a kind of a viewpoint that has both a substantive and epistemological component. So the substantive component is that the structure of the social world is amenable to manipulation and control. And the epistemological component is that we can reliably learn to predict the impacts of our reforms using RCTs and other causal inference methods. Now, this is a viewpoint that I would say is incredibly prevalent in the world right now, and very prevalent among economists, and also among nonprofits and groups that are trying to make a difference, Arnold Ventures, so on and so forth. And I just don't think it's supported by the evidence, to be honest, when it comes down to it. This is, by the way, this is evidence-based reform. This is one of the mindsets behind it. At least when it comes to limited scope systems conserving interventions, the types of things that are answered by RCTs, I think the engineer's view is mostly a myth. I don't think the world works in the way that it would need to in order to be able to engineer change in this sort of like highly confident, we pilot test it, we know that it proved that it works, we scale it up, kind of way that is often sold in the evidence-based movement. All right, and then the second thing, so, just because I say all this, like everyone still wants change, right? Like we all still care about the world. We want it to be a better place, like however you think better is, And so how do we move on from there? Unfortunately, spoiler alert, I don't really have like the answer for you, but I do have a few suggestions. Like I feel like most of what this paper does is say, this particular model of change is not well supported. The evidence suggests that the structure of the social world doesn't lend itself well to this kind of evidence-based engineer's view approach to change. But that doesn't mean we're going to stop doing things. So let's think about a few other options. So one is, if you want to see change, you can just focus on direct harm alleviation. If you're worried about hunger, feed people. If you're worried about people not having a place to sleep, to be sheltered from the evidence, you can give people homes. So there's nothing that I have said in this study has taken number one away as an option. Number two is that if the current status quo is unacceptable to you, the evidence that I've come up with pushes against limited scope systems conserving change, or at least that being kind of like a major, leading to major sources of change. You can pursue systemic reform. But as I said, when you pursue systemic reform, you are doing so with uncertainty. You don't know, you can't, you not only can't do an RCT, causal inference does not have methods. Like we really, you're diving in based on theory, on your intuition, and your theory and intuition is not going to be that guy's theory and intuition. But that's, obviously that's option number two. And for some people, that's the one that they feel called for. And then finally, this paper is not ruling out incrementalism either. It's just saying that the kind of limited scope steps that you make in systems conserving change is not going to have big impact. And it's, to the extent that it's impactful in one setting, it's, there's reason to doubt that it'll be impactful in other settings. But our methods don't rule out small impacts. They don't rule out small impacts in either direction, in the right direction or the wrong direction. But, you can use you can still work with your intuition and your theory and your hopes and keep moving in an incrementalist fashion in the hopes that we're taking steps in the right direction. So I think that's all I want to leave you with for today. Just a quick summarization. So I argue RCTs teach us something really valuable about the structure of the social world. That when it comes to limited scope interventions, stabilizing forces push against change, cascades are few, causal processes are complex and context dependent. And I just want to reiterate, I truly don't see this as depressing. I truly see this as a testament to people's will to be able to create things on their own. And to the extent that there remain limits to their ability to create the world that they want on their own, these limits come from kind of deep structural forces, that are not easy to change. That's it.
I'll let you call on.
Sure. In the back.
So I know a lot of RCTs and how you can manipulate controls might run into ethical issues or also maybe rights-based perspectives. So is it possible that our limited scope interventions in the criminal justice context are very limited because of these more ethical limitations that you just can't set a control that some people get, these extra benefits and other people, get none of the benefits. And maybe if we pursued, loosened maybe some of these, quote unquote, ethical restraints on RCTs, that we would maybe have a potential for wider scope.
I would say possibly. I mean, I don't. There have been RCTs with, I think, a fairly wide scope. Like the one I was just talking about, they gave a group of low-income families $1,000 a month for 2 years, which amounted to something like, a significant portion, because they were pretty low income. It was a significant boost in their monthly income, and it was across an extended period of time. And like I said, the main takeaway people seem to be. For me, I'm like, oh, they got money. That's great. Good for them, But people saw it as like a failure because it didn't have these extended impacts. There's also, studies showing that access to health insurance doesn't, lead to any noticeable health gains. Again, there's always probably somebody for whom it was make or break, but there was lots and lots of other people for whom it wasn't. So I certainly would imagine that the larger the intervention, the more likely you are to find something. Henri?
First, thank you for opening our mind to that broader question about the implications. But a little bit curious about how you got to where you ended with. So that study you based on, there were a lot of RCTs that did not find statistical significant results, although sometimes that's what's interesting, finding that famous diet plans don't work, and null result is a very publishable result. But part of what you told us is that they just didn't replicate. Didn't show us that they replicated, and they replicated less, and they kind of, over time, dulled down because some stabilizing forces started pushing, crowding them out. They just didn't replicate, so I didn't see anything that has to do with stabilizing forces pushing back.
Yeah, so again, if these abstractions are not useful for you, you can just be like, wow, RCTs just generally don't have much impact. But for me, it's very helpful. So when I think of stabilizing forces, I'm thinking of the example of the job training program, where you have somebody recently released from prison, and for the 3 or 6 months that they're in this job training program and they have subsidized employment, their day-to-day life is quite different. They're working every day. They've got money coming in. They've got some degree of stability. They've got whatever engagement is required for participation in the program. And so I think of that as like that's kind of them being pushed off their trajectory. Otherwise, they probably would not have been employed. And in fact, evidence shows they probably would not have been employed. But the thing is, instead of having that kind of catch, and then once the program is over and their employment is no longer subsidized, and they have to kind of get a new job or convince the boss to keep them on at full money out of the boss's pocket. That's when their paths kind of veer back to where they would have been. That's when we don't see the gains sticking or growing in terms of benefits. We see that within a very short amount of time, their employment rates and rearrest rates are identical to the group that had not taken this program. And so when I think of stabilizing forces in that example, I think of, we've still got the same guy. The guy's still got the criminal record. Having a criminal record makes it really hard to get a job in the United States. And he has whatever level of education he had. He has whatever, whatever barriers that, have made it difficult for him to get a job to begin with. Sometimes that might be mental health or substance abuse things or family members that are constantly needing help, or just different things in his life that made it hard to get a job in the first place and didn't go away. They're still there. And, so that's what I think of as stabilizing forces. Is that, yeah?
I had almost the same question, which is the claim that this is stabilizing forces is an empirical claim. The question is whether you can bring evidence to support that claim as opposed to saying, well, it just seems like it must be so. Right, I think that's a question. Let me ask another comment, which is, one area of you've probably done it already is in development. As you know, there's lots of RCTs in development, and most of them don't work, or the ones that do, don't seem to have any long-term effect on overall growth rate. So your initial slide saying, if you don't want to think outside of criminal context, don't. But you could easily just add on development stuff into this and say, well, it works at least in those 2 areas.
Yeah. So, I mean, if I ever write a book, which sounds like a lot of work, if I will, but I have thought about expanding and bringing that other stuff. It just is too much for a paper at this point. So I don't feel like I give it enough defense in the paper, and so I don't want to. But I actually do really think it's true, and I think there's, I thought it beforehand, and since I wrote it, a lot of people have come to me being like, yeah, that's kind of how it is in my field too. As for your first thing, I just want to reiterate what I said, which is that when I'm talking about the things like stabilizing forces, lack of cascades, complex, that is, for me, that is just reiterating don't hear that as me making an empirical claim that I need to support. For me, I'm just literally trying to reiterate the evidence from RCTs in a more abstract way. And so stabilizing forces is just a way of expressing, and maybe it's, I don't know, you may object with this way of expressing, but the way of expressing that in many instances, there are kind of short-term impacts of being in the program, like the direct mechanical impacts of being in the program, but then over time, you can just picture the chart. There's the short-term impacts of being in the program, and then over time, they go back and converge to, to the path they would have been on. Yeah.
Would you mind going back to the previous slide very quickly?
Yeah.
So a whole bunch of years ago, Tom Miles told me that he thought it was a trope in legal scholarship that we all want to write comedies and not tragedies. And I guess I'm just having a really hard time not reading what you've presented here as a tragedy, and wondering how we get to these particular implications. So, let's assume I bought in completely to the first 3/4 of the talk, which I thought was very convincing. Point number one, focus on direct harm alleviation. I understand that if you give someone who's hungry a loaf of bread, like in a half an hour, they'll probably be less hungry. But that's not the sort of program that we can create. We can build food banks or bring grocery stores to neighborhoods that are food deserts, or we can, build affordable housing or build shelter beds or something like that. And those are all the same sorts of interventions that you've just convinced us are unlikely to be effective.
Wait, let me be clear. I think everything you said sounds to me like one. I think if you build shelter beds, you will have fewer people homeless. I don't think, but those are the sorts of things that they don't get. That's the sort of obvious, direct question that doesn't really get answered by RCTs. Granted, there are gray areas, of what's obvious and what isn't. But like, if it's more like if you build housing, if you build, I don't know. This would be a hard one to do in RCTs, but it's the sort of convoluted indirect thing.
Sure, although you also said that like changing the amount or the likelihood or the speed at which punishment is delivered doesn't change crime. Like that seems like that's a pretty direct impact. Also, we're not talking about whether it changes the person's level of education 20 years down the line. So if that sort of thing isn't working, and you suggest that we should generalize that to all of society, building 100 extra shelter beds in downtown Chicago, it's unclear whether that will change the unhoused population on the south side. And same thing for, I won't belabor it, but the sort of same things for 2 and 3. Like you started out by saying, it's very hard to make big systemic changes. You can't change someone's class because you can't adjust 17 things all at once. So, pursuing systemic reform sounds pretty challenging. And then continue with incrementalism sounds very much like, well, you finished telling us only half of the studies actually have an effect in the right direction, but let's just keep doing them anyway because maybe they're incrementally good. That sounds like throwing good money after bad. So I guess I'm not sure how we get to these implications and why. I'm hoping you can convince me why not to feel more depressed.
All right. Well, in terms of the depression thing, my best advice would be to sit with it for a little while, and then once you start thinking of it as the state of the world, it doesn't really,
Spirit that nobody's life improves.
Yeah, but that's not true. The second thing is, obviously the world changes. Like, obviously, right? I mean, some things are stickier than we'd want to be. Some things are, where there's maybe less improvements that we'd want to have seen. But, there have been huge leaps made in so many areas of our world. And so, and incrementalism, I almost don't even like the word, because everything is incremental once you break it down to the steps that take you to get there. Systemic change is incremental, like a bunch of incremental steps that maybe, I don't know, maybe they were just put together a little bit more rapidly, or maybe once you step back and look at all those incremental steps, you're like, okay, let's call this systemic change. I mean, the world changes. The only thing maybe the most depressing thing is that we're not as good as we thought we were in terms of being able to clearly control it. on this level of limited scope interventions. But we're doing something. And all we can do is keep doing the things that feel right to us in terms of action. For me, I put one is where my heart personally lies. Like I have trouble thinking about big picture. Like I don't even know what big picture world I want to live in. Like which big ideology like speaks the most to me. It all feels a little like abstract. I feel like all I can do is try to be a good person and try to help out other people as much as I can. And so like I feel like if everyone's doing one, we're going to move in the right direction. But I think people have different allegiances and different feelings about these different areas. I don't know if that helped, but.
I think we have time for one more brief question.
Hajin?
So I want to take this in a potentially more hopeful direction. All of these studies are looking at average treatment effects, and I'm wondering how much, and we usually think of RCTs as confirmatory research. We have a hypothesis and we try to confirm it as yet right or wrong. But what if we think about RCTs as exploratory research and see, okay, if they have an effect but only on certain populations, and so it gives us something to look at, like why does it work for that population? Like your job training program, maybe it only works for some people because that's the real barrier for those people, but for other people, really what they need is mental health treatment. So of course we don't see a large effect or an effect at all because we have all this mix of people in there. And so maybe it can help us target components. The second thing is, it's interesting that you're like sort of just writing off RCTs when you're looking at like small bore, low cost intervention, because they could still be like cost benefit justified, right? Because they are so low cost, it could still be that they're like the small amount of benefits we do see from finding, or like what Marie said, like going through and sort of finding like this thing we shouldn't invest resources in, or this thing we should, and there may be a small effect, but there's still an effect, and hey, it's actually not that expensive for us to do. So like instead of saying like, oh, no more, like the stabilizing forces of this world are just gonna keep everything the same, like why not use RCTs for exploratory research, and why not say like they still may be super useful where they can be, you can show a cost benefit sort of net benefit.
So first of all, I haven't said stop running RCTs. And I also haven't said stop doing limited scope interventions. But let me address your first thing. So yes, it is theoretically possible that in the sort of, in the average effects that we're identifying with RCTs, it is hiding, that this is beneficial for some small group of people and maybe net the opposite, net harmful for some group of people, and it's all kind of averaging out in the wash. So first of all, I want to say like RCTs are already in some regards, like people want them to win, you know what I'm saying? People are coming in with their money and their time and their investment to like try and create a success here. And so they've already done some preliminary building on their theory or their knowledge of the situation, trying to target it towards the people they think it's going to help them the most. Now, once you start breaking it into groups, the power that you need, the sample size that you need goes up exponentially. So if you really have, if you're just really like, I'm going to let the data tell me which group this is most beneficial for, in order to do that rigorously and adjust for your multiple hypothesis and all that, you just need such a big sample size. And it gets extraordinarily expensive to run those. And so and it also increases your, unless you're really good about your pre-registration, increases your, the opportunities for p-hacking. Like, oh, look, I happen to find a subset for whom this works. Like ta-da, that's going to be the highlight. This is my feature of this paper. Like, yes, I got it into a top journal. So I'm not super optimistic about that. I'm not ruling it out, but like I think that's sort of a very burdensome task from kind of technical standpoints. What was the other one? Oh, in terms of, yeah, so most of the time, the thing is most of the time RCTs are not powered to identify small effects. And so what we're doing is we're rejecting, in any individual study, we're kind of rejecting kind of anything larger than like a moderate effect, I guess you could say. And you just don't have a ton of knowledge about whether the small effect is there and is going to be net cost beneficial. And you can keep, and a lot of times you might be like, common sense is enough for me. Like, I really think this is an improvement. There's reason to believe this is going to take us in a better direction. Let's go ahead and do it. I'm fine with the small effect, but small steps in the right direction. And I think that's totally fine. And if you have the money and you want to run an RCT, like, more power to you.
Well, as someone who's a huge fan of law and economics, there's a day when economics will shake off its title as the dismal science. Maybe not today, but thank you for a marvelous lecture and a great inaugural lecture. And now it's my pleasure to present to you the official prize, the Nobel Ephraim Prize, is that you can open it later. It's an RCT. Congratulations and thank you.
Aw, thank you so much. What an honor. Ooh, crystal cave.
Thank you everybody for joining us.